The fear of death may not come from death itself, but from the images your mind creates when it cannot understand necessity. You have felt it, not always loudly, not always in a moment of crisis. Sometimes it comes in the middle of an ordinary night when the room is quiet and the mind suddenly turns towards something it cannot hold. The thought arrives without invitation. One day you will not be here. The people you love will not be here. Everything you have built, everything you have felt, everything you have called your life will dissolve into a silence that does not remember your name. And the chest tightens, the breath shortens, the mind runs. It is not only the fear of your own disappearance. It is the fear of losing the ones who make existence feel real. It is the panic of wasted time, the suspicion that you have spent your years on the wrong things and that the clock is no longer forgiving. For some, there is a deeper terror underneath all of that. A fear of divine judgment, of being weighed and found insufficient, of facing something after death that punishes what you were in life. These fears do not always speak clearly. They move through you as unease, as restlessness, as the need to stay busy, as the avoidance of silence. They are real, they are heavy, and most people carry them alone. Spinoza will not tell you that death is a door to paradise. He will not offer you a story designed to make the pain manageable through distraction. What Spinoza offers is far more radical and far more difficult. He offers you a way of understanding that changes your relationship to mortality from the inside. Not comfort, understanding. And the difference between those two things is the entire distance between living in fear and living in freedom. Most people believe that death anxiety is solved by not thinking about death. Distract yourself enough, stay entertained enough, stay occupied enough, and the fear loses its power. This is the first lie the mind tells itself. Denial does not dissolve fear, it stores it. Every moment of avoided thought becomes compressed into the nervous system, emerging later as a low, persistent dread that has no single face but surrounds everything. The mind that runs from death does not escape it. It simply learns to run without stopping. Others seek comfort in beautiful stories, the afterlife, reincarnation, the assurance that consciousness does not end. These stories are not all worthless, some of them carry genuine wisdom. But when a story is used primarily to silence a fear rather than to understand it, it becomes a cage with comfortable walls. You stop asking the deeper question. You stop examining the cause of the anxiety. You accept the story because the alternative feels unbearable. And so the fear remains intact, underneath the belief, waiting for any moment of doubt to reclaim its full force. Here is what most people miss. The suffering does not come primarily from death. It comes from the image of death. Think carefully about this distinction. You have never experienced your own death. No one living has. What you experience is your imagination constructing a picture of non-existence, of loss, of darkness, of the end of everything that feels familiar. And the mind then responds to that picture with the full force of emotional reaction, as if the picture were the reality itself. You are suffering from a representation, not from the thing itself. Spinoza called this kind of suffering a passive emotion. It is a state in which the mind is moved by forces it does not fully understand, swept by images and associations and inherited fears, without ever stepping back to examine the causes of what is happening inside. The imagination is not a reliable guide to truth. It is powerful, it is vivid, it is deeply convincing. But it creates pictures based on memory, association, and incomplete understanding, not on adequate knowledge of how reality actually works. And when imagination is the only tool the mind uses to approach death, the result is almost always terror. The hidden enemy, then, is not death. The hidden enemy is the confusion between an image and a truth. The mind looks at the image of its own disappearance and treats that image as a complete and final understanding of what death is. But that image is shaped by your particular history, your particular fears, your particular relationship to time and loss and meaning. It is not the whole picture. It is not even close to the whole picture. And as long as the image rules, the fear rules with it. Look at the world you live in, and you will see this prison everywhere. The obsession with youth is not merely vanity. It is a symptom. Every product designed to hide aging, every cultural message that treats the visible marks of time as defects to be corrected, every celebration of youth as though it were a permanent state rather than a passing season, all of it is a collective refusal to look at mortality directly. The culture teaches you to fear the evidence of time passing because it fears the conclusion that evidence eventually points toward. The result is a civilization that is deeply anxious about death while pretending not to think about it at all. There is also the pressure to make life constantly meaningful, to fill every hour with achievement, to be productive, to leave a legacy, to be remembered. Not all of this is wrong, but underneath much of it is a terror of irrelevance. The fear that if you stop performing, if you stop producing, if you become quiet for a moment, you will be forced to face the question that productivity was designed to silence. What is all of this for if it ends? Grief is avoided, not processed. Silence is filled, not inhabited. And the fear of death grows stronger in the dark, because no one is willing to bring it into the light long enough to examine it. If this is beginning to open something in you, consider pressing the like button right now. Not as a habit, but as a signal. Someone else is carrying this same fear tonight, searching for something more than distraction. Your small action helps this reach them. Baruch Spinoza was not a philosopher of the afterlife. He was a philosopher of life, of understanding, of the infinite intelligence of nature that produces all things according to necessary causes. He lived in the 17th century, was excommunicated from his community for the power of his thinking, and spent his life in careful, radical inquiry into what it means for a human being to be free. He did not promise heaven. He did not offer consoling fictions. What he offered was something rarer and more demanding. A way of seeing reality clearly enough that the fear of necessity loses its grip on the mind. For Spinoza, death is not a punishment. It is not a judgment. It is not a mistake in the fabric of existence. It is a necessary transformation within a nature that is infinite, eternal, and indifferent in the deepest sense, not cold, but complete. Every individual thing that exists through the power of nature expressing itself in a particular form. When that form dissolves, nature does not lose anything. The power that animated that form does not disappear. It returns to the whole from which it always came. Spinoza was not offering poetry here. He was offering a philosophical structure that, if genuinely understood, does not merely comfort the fear of death. It dissolves the grounds on which that fear stands. Spinoza taught that nothing happens without a cause. Every emotion you feel has a cause. Fear of death is not an exception, it is an effect. And like all effects, it can be traced. The trace begins not with death itself, but with imagination. The mind imagines futures it cannot control, imagines endings it has never experienced, imagines the silence that follows life and fills that silence with the echoes of its deepest uncertainties. Imagination operates through inadequate ideas, through partial pictures of reality that feel complete but are not, and fear lives inside those gaps. The second cause is uncertainty. Human beings do not know what death involves. They know what it looks like from the outside. The stillness of a body, the absence of a person once present. But what death is from the inside, from the perspective of the one who dies, no one living can report. The mind fills this uncertainty with stories. Sometimes those stories are comforting. Sometimes they are terrifying. But in both cases, it is the imagination working without adequate understanding. And that is precisely where Spinoza locates the source of suffering. Not in death itself, but in the mind's relationship to what it does not yet understand. Attachment is the third cause. You fear losing what you love. And love is real. This is not an illusion to be dismissed, but there is a way of loving that is entangled with dependency, with the belief that your power to live well depends entirely on the continued presence of specific people, specific conditions, specific arrangements of reality. When that belief is never examined, loss becomes existential. The prospect of death, your own or another's, becomes a threat not only to happiness but to the sense of self. Spinoza does not tell you to stop loving. He tells you to understand the nature of your attachment, because understanding is what transforms dependency into genuine love. Spinoza distinguished between passive emotions and active understanding. A passive emotion is one in which you are driven by forces you do not understand. You are moved from the outside without knowing why. You react to an image, to a memory, to a fear without tracing its cause. Death anxiety in most people is a passive emotion. It arrives, it overwhelms, and the person who experiences it feels helpless before it, because they do not understand what is actually happening inside them. They see the fear, but not the mechanism. They feel the weight, but not the cause. Active understanding changes the structure of this experience. When the mind begins to trace the causes of its fear, when it asks not only what am I feeling, but what is producing this feeling and why, something shifts. The emotion does not immediately vanish. Spinoza was not naive about that, but its power over the mind begins to weaken. You are no longer simply inside the fear. You are also observing it. And observation in Spinoza's system is the beginning of freedom. The fear becomes an object of inquiry rather than an unquestioned master. This is what it means to see death through Spinoza's lens. It means stopping the automatic response long enough to ask, what exactly am I afraid of? Is it non-existence? Is it losing what I love? Is it judgment? Is it the unknown? Is it the feeling of wasted time? Each of these is a different fear with different causes, and when you separate them and examine them clearly, you discover that death itself is not the source of most of what terrifies you. The source is in your relationship to life, to uncertainty, to necessity, and to your own imagination. That discovery does not make mortality painless, but it makes it comprehensible, and comprehension is the beginning of power. You are not broken for fearing death. Do not let anyone tell you that this fear is a sign of weakness or a failure of faith or a deficiency of character. The fear of death is one of the most ancient, most universal experiences in human life. It appears in every culture, every era, every tradition. It has driven the greatest art, the most profound religion, the most ambitious philosophy. You carry it not because you are defective, but because you are alive and capable of understanding that life is finite, that awareness is not a disease. It is the beginning of seriousness. What Spinoza asks is not that you stop feeling. He asks that you stop accepting the first image your mind produces as the final and complete truth. The person who fears death is not wrong to feel something deep and serious about mortality. The mistake is only in allowing imagination, unexamined and unguided by reason, to define the entire experience. Fear is understandable. Fear treated as unquestionable reality, never investigated, never traced, never seen for what it actually is. That is where suffering deepens unnecessarily. Grief is real. The pain of loss is real. The ache of missing someone who is gone is not a philosophical mistake. Spinoza never denied the reality of these things. He felt them himself. But he also understood that the suffering that comes from not understanding the causes of our pain is an additional suffering, a suffering added on top of the real wound by the mind's confusion. And that additional layer is where philosophy can genuinely help. Not to erase the wound, but to remove the confusion that makes it infinitely heavier than it needs to be. Think of the mind's encounter with death as standing before an ocean at night. You cannot see the bottom. You cannot see the other shore. You cannot know what lives in the water or how far it extends. The darkness is real. The uncertainty is real. But here is what happens inside most minds. Instead of standing at the shore and observing the ocean honestly, the imagination immediately begins painting the darkness. It fills the water with monsters. It invents the cold. It constructs drowning before a single step has been taken. And the person standing at the shore is now suffering from a painted ocean, not the real one. This is what imagination does with death. The actual fact of mortality is beyond the reach of experience while we are alive. It stands at the horizon of what the mind can know. But imagination refuses to accept the horizon as a boundary. It projects beyond it furiously, using everything it has ever learned about loss, about pain, about ending, about fear. And the projection becomes the experience. You do not fear death. You fear the image your mind has constructed in the place where knowledge runs out. The image is built from many materials, from the deaths you have witnessed, from the bodies you have seen, from the grief you have felt when someone left, from stories told in childhood about what happens after life ends, from religious images, some beautiful, some terrifying, from the silence in a room where someone was and suddenly is not. All of these experiences are real, but the image assembled from them is a particular construction, not a complete truth. And a particular construction can be examined, questioned, and seen more clearly. Spinoza called this kind of mental state an inadequate idea. It is not wrong simply because it contains errors. It is inadequate because it presents a partial picture as if it were complete. The mind looks at its image of death and says, "This is what death is." But that image is made of memory and association and emotion, not of adequate understanding of what reality actually requires. And once the mind begins to see that its suffering is partly self-generated, not all of it, but a meaningful portion of it, a new possibility opens. The possibility of understanding instead of running. Here is the truth that most people do not want to hear. Many people fear death not because they understand what it is, but because they do not know how to live. The terror of the end is often underneath its surface, a terror of the unlived, of the things left unsaid, of the years spent in compliance with other people's expectations, of the choices avoided because fear felt safer than commitment, of the love not fully expressed because vulnerability felt too dangerous. Death becomes the mirror that reflects everything the living have postponed. When you have not learned how to live with understanding, with clarity about what you actually value and why, death appears not only as an ending but as an indictment. The mind says there will not be enough time to finally become what you were capable of becoming. And that is not really a fear of death at all. That is a fear of life half-lived. Spinoza's answer to this is not a consoling reassurance. It is a challenge. If the terror of death is partly a terror of unlived life, then the practice that dissolves the fear is not more thinking about death. It is deeper, more deliberate, more conscious living. If you are beginning to see that what you feared was not death but an image your mind had built in the place of understanding, comment the word freedom below. You are not alone in this. And naming what you are beginning to see is already part of the work. The first practice Spinoza's philosophy points toward is this: do not let death anxiety remain a single, undivided mass of fear. Name its causes specifically. Sit with the discomfort long enough to ask what precisely is driving the feeling. For some people, the primary cause is the fear of non-existence, the thought that consciousness ends and everything experienced simply stops. For others, the cause is attachment, the unbearable prospect of separation from the people and experiences that give life its weight and beauty. These are genuinely different fears, and they require different understanding. For others still, the cause is guilt. The sense that life has been spent wrongly, that there is a debt unpaid, a wrong not corrected, a version of oneself not yet reached. The fear of death then carries the additional weight of incompleteness, and for many who carry religious histories, the cause is judgment, the image of a God who watches and measures and ultimately decides the fate of the soul. This fear has roots that run very deep and cannot be dismissed with a single philosophical sentence. But it can be examined, and examining it is already an act of courage. When you name the specific cause of your fear, you do something crucial. You move from the overwhelming whole to the examinable particular. Spinoza's entire philosophical method is built on this movement. Not the vague general suffering, but the traceable specific cause. The mind that can name what it fears can begin to understand it. The mind that cannot name it remains inside it without any direction of exit. This does not mean the fear immediately dissolves when you name it. It means you are finally standing beside it rather than inside it entirely. The second practice is this. Fear of death is something that moves through you. It is not what you are. There is a difference between the emotion and the person who experiences it. Spinoza's framework is clear on this point. You are not your fear. You are the mind in which that fear arises, and the mind is capable of far more than any single emotion that passes through it. When the fear arrives and the mind says, "This is all that I am right now," something important is being confused. The wave is being mistaken for the ocean. This matters because when fear becomes identity, it becomes permanent. The person who says, "I am someone who fears death," is building an entire self-concept around a particular emotional pattern, and a self built on fear will make decisions based on fear, will interpret experience through fear, will find evidence for fear everywhere it looks. But the person who says, "I am experiencing fear of death right now, and I want to understand it," has preserved a distance from the emotion that makes inquiry possible. That distance is not coldness. It is not detachment from life. It is the beginning of genuine power. Spinoza speaks of the power of acting, the conatus, the fundamental drive in every being to persist, to grow, to express itself more fully in the world. Fear, when it is identified with rather than understood, diminishes that power. It contracts the self. It narrows the field of what feels possible. But when the mind observes the fear with understanding, the power of acting is not diminished. It is redirected. The energy that was feeding the anxiety begins to feed something more aligned with what you actually are and what you actually value. This is not a small shift. It is a transformation in the direction of living. Spinoza taught that joy, in his philosophical sense, is the increase of the power to act, and that this increase is produced through encounters with things that strengthen the mind and body. You have more agency over your encounters than you typically acknowledge. This is not naive optimism. It is a structural observation about how the mind is shaped by what it regularly meets. The mind that spends its time in encounters with beauty, with philosophy, with meaningful relationships, with nature, with ideas that expand rather than contract the sense of what is possible. that mind is genuinely changed by those encounters. Nature is one of the most powerful correctives to death anxiety that Spinoza's philosophy points toward, not as a sentimental escape, but as a direct confrontation with necessity itself. When you stand before something vast, a mountain range, an ancient forest, an ocean at dawn, you're standing before a portion of what Spinoza called God or nature, the infinite self-caused reality of which you are a part. And in that encounter, something in the human mind recalibrates. The smallness of your fear relative to the magnitude of what is real becomes perceptible, not because you are unimportant, but because you are part of something that does not require your approval to continue. Meaningful relationships also belong here, not relationships maintained out of dependency or fear of abandonment, but genuine encounters with other minds, with other people's joys and sufferings and understanding. Spinoza saw human beings as most powerful when they cooperate through reason. The person who engages honestly and deeply with others, who gives and receives understanding, who allows love to be something more than a protection against loneliness. That person is building a life that already contains its own answer to the fear of death. Not a logical refutation, a lived reality that makes the fear less total, less defining, less necessary. The fourth practice is the most difficult and the most transformative. Spinoza called it the intellectual love of God. The amor intellectualis Dei, the capacity of the mind to see reality as it actually is and to affirm it, not merely to endure it. Applied to death, this means accepting mortality as a necessary feature of nature's order, not as an enemy to be defeated, not as a punishment to be survived, but as the condition within which a finite, conscious life becomes meaningful at all. This is not resignation. It is something much harder and much freer than resignation. Acceptance of necessity does not mean becoming passive in the face of what can be changed. Spinoza was not advocating collapse. He was advocating clarity. There are things in reality that are necessary, that fall within the domain of what must be as part of the structure of existence. Death is among them. And the mind that fights against necessary things, that spends its energy in protest against what cannot be otherwise, is a mind diminishing its own power by directing that power against a wall. The energy spent raging against mortality could instead be directed toward the quality, depth, and clarity of the life being lived right now. This is where acceptance becomes an act of power rather than defeat. When you genuinely accept that death is necessary, not as a dark thought suppressed, but as a truth integrated into the way you move through each day, your priorities clarify. What you spend time on becomes more deliberate. How you treat the people in your life becomes less postponed. The things you have been waiting to feel, to say, to attempt, begin to seem less deferrable. Mortality, understood through Spinoza's lens, does not make life meaningless. It makes it urgent in the most honest possible sense. It transforms the question from how do I avoid the end to how do I inhabit the time that is genuinely mine. Consider what has been revealed in this inquiry. Death anxiety does not come primarily from death. It comes from the images the mind constructs in the place of understanding. The imagination fills the unknown with everything it has ever feared, and the mind responds to that construction as if it were reality itself. This is not weakness. It is what happens when any mind encounters an experience that lies beyond direct knowledge. But it is also a condition that can be changed through understanding. And understanding for Spinoza is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is the highest form of power available to a conscious being. The practice that emerges from this understanding is not a technique for forgetting death. It is a discipline of living more clearly in the presence of it. Name the specific cause of your fear. Separate the fear from your identity. Choose encounters that increase your power to live rather than diminish it. And accept necessity not as defeat but as the very ground on which genuine freedom becomes possible. Spinoza's answer to death is not an afterlife. It is a way of living that renders the terror of death proportionate to what it actually is, and no larger than that. You came to this inquiry as someone who fears death. That is honest. That is human. But consider who you are becoming as you move through this understanding. You are not someone who has abolished death anxiety forever. Spinoza makes no such promise, and neither will this channel. But you are becoming someone who can look at the fear and ask what causes this rather than simply running from the question. That difference is everything, because the person who asked that question is no longer fully controlled by the fear. They are in a relationship with it that has some room for understanding inside it. This is the identity that Spinoza's philosophy makes possible. Not a person beyond emotion, not a cold machine of pure reason, but a person who uses reason not to escape feeling but to understand it. Someone who can grieve without being consumed by grief. Someone who can contemplate mortality without turning that contemplation into a paralysis. Someone who can say, I know that I am finite. I know that everything I love is finite, and I choose to live fully within that finitude rather than spending it in flight from what I cannot change. That person is not fearless. That person is free. Return now to where this inquiry began. The fear of death may not come from death itself, but from the images your mind creates when it cannot understand necessity. You have now sat with that idea long enough to feel what it means. The images your mind was using were not complete knowledge. They were constructions. Powerful and convincing, but partial. And a partial picture, no matter how vivid, is not a prison you are required to live inside forever. Understanding is not the end of all pain, but it is the beginning of a different relationship to it. One in which you are present and inquiring rather than simply afraid. If this inquiry has opened something in you, if Spinoza's way of approaching mortality has given you a different kind of ground to stand on, subscribe to Spinoza Reveals. Every video on this channel is built around the same promise. Not comfort, not fantasy, not the reassurance that everything will be fine, but understanding. And understanding, as Spinoza knew and as you are beginning to know, is the only thing that has ever made a human being genuinely free.